that, Pascal?
Yes, but I actually, what's interesting to me about this class of individuals, the foundation world coming out of Black Lives Matter, academics, etc., who never would want to stake their politics on being true Marxists, anti-capitalists, or socialists in the tradition of, the old line that would primarily use capitalism to explain the condition of black people.
Hmm.
As but instead, what we get is rad libs or anti-racist
Hmm.
liberalism that's designed to fundamentally fit black people or black workers into the capitalist hierarchy, but
Hmm.
just looking for rearranging the deck chairs of the Titanic without addressing the core problem of distribution within capitalism.
Right. Right.
So
Now,
can you address for me how the disparitarian logic, racial disparities, which I find one of the most sabotaging mechanisms to end any type of logic of coalition building,
hmm
how that becomes popular in the wake of, say, the birth of a socialist consciousness around Bernie Sanders, almost
hmm
almost too. If I had to say, it's so cynical to say almost was this planned in the way the timing of this stuff comes about, as to say that, oh, these socialists don't understand race.
right. Right. No, that's great. That's a great question. So let me say a few things, in response to that. I mean, we have to deal with the fact that maybe the high tide of a socialist politics in this country was really the New Deal period, right? The era of the Popular Front, and or as I guess Michael Denning refers to the Cultural Front. This idea that you had for a moment um, a broad sense within the country that people were sympathetic towards some socialist ideas. I think a quarter of Americans, during that period in the 1930s, supported socialism, and maybe another 35% were open to the idea. And that was from a poll that was taken in Fortune magazine, right? And so there was a high tide of popularity and of acceptance of that, and we saw it manifested in so many different aspects of the society at that particular time, in popular culture, but also in various social struggles that were unfolding. After World War II, there's an active campaign to defeat socialism within the labor movement, and also within mass cultural institutions, right? In particular in Hollywood, because clearly enough, capital was fearful of what would happen if these ideas continued to spread. And so, as I've noted in other work that I've done, and I'm not certainly not the first one to do this, the transformation of American life after World War II, um, in particular, the expansion of cities, the making of a property owning middle class in suburbia, all has the effect of really killing, whatever momentum socialism might have had, during the Depression years. And we're still dealing with that, right? And what happens at the same time, and this goes to Pascal's point, during that same period in which Communist Party members, various kinds of socialists are being uh, persecuted within the country, right, and within the civil rights movement as well, targeted and persecuted. At that very same during that very same period, the idea that race is the main axis of conflict really begins to have a moment of renewal in American life, right? It becomes one way of and of course it's true in a sense that there's Jim Crow segregation, right? So it is a scourge in the society, but the idea that somehow it is the primary conflict is one that really begins to take root at that particular time. And even now, it's a safer one for us to have a conversation about. And I think, to come back to the disparities argument, there's a few reasons why it's become dominant in my mind, right? Part of it has to do with the subprime mortgage crisis and the ways in which the subprime mortgage crisis really decimated the conditions of the Black middle class. I mean, places like Detroit, before the subprime mortgage crisis, you had over 70% of the mortgages in that town were owned by Black people. After the subprime mortgage crisis, that is more than cut in half. And so that kind of scenario is repeated around the country. And it's easy for these writers at at the Atlantic, at the New Yorker, and the New York Times to talk about this because this has been the running script since the Cold War, to focus on the persistence of racial inequality and really to deny any sort of open discussion, open anti-capitalist criticism, in those major, so-called opinion making type media. And so again, we saw various Black writers, Black academics who stepped forward to really push this idea that racial disparity was the main problem. And another dimension of it, and we're 20 years after the fact, but another dimension was the backdrop of the Katrina disaster, which provided us, with, again, a powerful narrative, even though a false one, that most of the people who were stranded in New Orleans back in August and September of 2005 were stranded because they were Black, right? And it was a function of institutional racism and not a failure of policymakers, both within the federal government, but also at the state and local level, to create an evacuation plan that would have accommodated people who didn't own cars, people who didn't have a ton of disposable income. And so, with Katrina and then the subprime mortgage crisis, and then with the election of Obama, the kind of space for this disparitarian rhetoric to really take hold, it just was there, right? It had a lot of traction within that context. And, again, we're still there. I mean, notice how after the January wildfires, I mean, before those fires were even brought under control, the same kind of narrative that had dominated the discussion of the Katrina disaster, right? The focus on the homeowners in the lower Ninth Ward. This became a big part of, celebrity, interventions in New Orleans, right? The tendency that the decision of celebrities like Brad Pitt to go in through his Make It Right Foundation and rebuild homes, right? These were the kinds of people they were concerned about. They totally fucking ignored public housing residents, right? Who were scattered to the four winds, not allowed to move back into New Orleans, and they watched their, places that had been their home for some time demolished, right? Through one of the last waves of Hope 6 demolitions. During the wildfires, we saw the same sort of narrative reemerge quickly, right? The focus quickly was around homeowners in the Altadena, area, which, I know people in Altadena that lost their homes, and I'm totally in support of them rebuilding. But again, it's a convenient thing within media, both mass media, but also, social media, to focus in on Black homeowners, right, as deserving victims, and then to ignore all the other renters in Los Angeles who are going to be displaced and priced out of, this post-fire market that's already taken shape. And so, this is just another. It's one way to focus on economy and on inequality, but it's still connected to an older set of civil rights discourses that just doesn't help the vast majority of Black people who are working class and who are not homeowners. And it just doesn't necessarily help, people in the population more generally. So, again, there's all sorts of writers and, people working for foundations and various activist organizations who will, talk about racial disparity to the end of time, but they don't really have an answer for the kind of thing that we're witnessing right now in the midst of this Trump, Elon Musk regime that's been in place for the last few weeks.